In the darkest moments of our lives, when loss feels unbearable, we search for answers that seem impossible to find. Lewis, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, faced this same darkness when he lost his beloved wife, Joy. But what he discovered about grief would change not just his life, but thousands of others who would read his raw, honest words. Today we're diving deep into 4 profound lessons that Lewis learned about grief. Lessons that might just change how you view loss, hope, and the human heart. These aren't your typical self-help insights. They're hard-earned truths that emerged from the depths of real pain and authentic healing. What makes these lessons so powerful is that they shatter our common misconceptions about grief. You'll discover why the standard advice about moving on might be doing more harm than good. You'll learn why some of your most painful moments might actually be signs of healing. And most importantly, you'll understand why hope often appears in ways we least expect. Whether you're currently navigating loss, supporting someone who is, or simply trying to understand this universal human experience better, these insights will give you a new perspective on grief that you won't find in conventional wisdom. Stay with me as we explore these 4 transformative lessons that challenge everything we think we know about loss and healing. Because sometimes the path through grief isn't about finding answers. It's about discovering truths we never thought to seek. Nothing could have prepared Lewis for what grief actually felt like. His scholarly mind, which had written eloquently about suffering and pain in the past, found itself completely disarmed by the raw reality of personal loss. Every theory, every philosophical understanding he held about grief shattered in the face of his wife's death. Grief hit him like waves of panic, fear, and emptiness all at once. In his own words, it felt less like sadness and more like fear, a constant gnawing sensation that turned familiar places into alien landscapes. His home, once filled with Joy's presence, became a minefield of memories. Simple objects, her handwriting on a shopping list, her favorite coffee cup, even the way sunlight fell across her empty chair, triggered waves of overwhelming emotion. Most surprising to Lewis was how grief invaded every aspect of his existence. His brilliant mind, usually sharp and analytical, became foggy and unreliable. Concentration slipped away like water through his fingers. Even basic tasks felt insurmountable, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, making everything more difficult and strange. In his personal journals, which later became A Grief Observed, Lewis described this initial period as a kind of madness. He questioned whether anyone who hadn't experienced deep loss could possibly understand its true nature. His previous intellectual understanding of grief seemed almost laughable now, like claiming to know what war feels like from reading history books. Perhaps most painful was the realization that grief wasn't just about missing Joy, it was about confronting an entirely new version of himself. Gone was the confident theologian who could explain life's mysteries. In his place stood someone more vulnerable, more uncertain, yet paradoxically more authentic. This initial collision with grief taught Lewis something profound. Real grief bears little resemblance to our preconceptions. It's not a gentle sadness that fades with time, but rather a force that reshapes our entire world. Through his raw honesty about these early days of loss, Lewis gives us permission to acknowledge the chaos and confusion that often accompany profound grief, showing us that even the wisest among us can be undone by loss. Physical pain, that's how Lewis described grief, shocking many who expected a more spiritual or emotional description from a renowned Christian thinker. Unlike depression or sadness, grief manifested in his body with an intensity that caught him completely off guard. His chest felt constantly tight, as if someone had wrapped iron bands around his rib cage. Sleep became elusive, yet exhaustion plagued every waking moment. Most striking was how grief seemed to alter his basic physical sensations. Food lost its taste, colors appeared muted, and even his own body felt foreign to him. In his private writings, he noted how grief created a kind of constant background noise in his nervous system, like static on an old radio that couldn't be tuned out. Writing about these physical symptoms, Lewis observed something profound. Society often treats grief as purely emotional, yet its physical manifestations are equally real and demanding. His muscles ached without exertion. His stomach churned even when empty. Simple tasks like getting dressed or making tea required monumental effort, as if gravity had somehow intensified around him. His research suggested monumental effort, as if gravity had somehow intensified around him. What fascinated Lewis was how these physical symptoms seemed to have their own timeline, completely independent of his emotional state. Some days, when he felt mentally stronger, his body would still be racked with exhaustion. Other times, his body felt almost normal while his mind struggled through fog and confusion. This disconnect between mind and body revealed grief's complex nature. It wasn't just feeling sad, it was experiencing a total system shock. Nighttime brought its own unique torments. His body would jerk awake at the exact times he used to tend to Joy during her illness. His hands would reach for her automatically across empty sheets. These weren't conscious actions, but rather his body's own form of remembering and grieving. Through documenting these physical experiences, Lewis challenged the common notion that grief is merely an emotional or spiritual journey. He showed how loss reverberates through every fiber of our physical being, demanding acknowledgement not just from our hearts and minds, but from our very flesh and bones. This recognition of grief's physical dimension offers validation to those who find themselves struggling not just emotionally, but physically with loss. Faith, once a sturdy foundation beneath Lewis's feet, suddenly felt like shifting sand. As grief tore through his life, questions erupted with volcanic force. Questions he'd previously answered for others with confident eloquence. Now, facing his own profound loss, those same answers rang hollow and insufficient. In raw, unfiltered journal entries, Lewis poured out doubts that would shock his followers. "Where is God?" he wrote, not as a philosophical inquiry, but as a gut-wrenching cry. His relationship with faith transformed from intellectual certainty to something far more complex and painful. Most disturbing to Lewis was how grief stripped away his religious pretenses. Previous writings about suffering and divine purpose felt like empty platitudes in face of actual loss. He found himself questioning not just God's goodness, but God's very existence. These weren't calm, rational theological debates in his mind. They were fierce battles that left him emotionally and spiritually exhausted. Particularly painful was reconciling Joy's death with his beliefs about divine love. How could a loving God allow such suffering? More troubling still, why did prayers seem to bounce off an empty sky? Lewis described feeling like a rat in a maze, running into wall after wall of theological explanations that no longer made sense. Yet paradoxically, this crisis of faith led Lewis to a deeper, more authentic spirituality. Through questioning everything he thought he knew about God, he discovered something unexpected: faith strong enough to hold doubt. His journey revealed that true faith isn't about having all answers, but about continuing to seek despite uncertainty. Within this spiritual wrestling match, Lewis uncovered a profound truth. Authentic faith often grows stronger through questioning rather than blind acceptance. His doubts didn't destroy his faith. They stripped it down to something more real, more honest, and ultimately more durable. This transformation suggested that perhaps spiritual crisis isn't a sign of failing faith. Through documenting this spiritual struggle, Lewis gave voice to countless others who find their faith challenged by loss. His honesty about doubt created space for believers to acknowledge their own questions without shame or fear. Mainstream wisdom often portrays grief as an orderly progression through stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Yet Lewis discovered something radically different. Grief moves like a drunk man staggering down a twisted path, lurching forward, backward, and sideways without warning or reason. One morning, Lewis would wake up feeling almost normal, as if healing had finally begun. By afternoon, grief would ambush him with such force it felt like day one all over again. Most surprising to Lewis was how healing often looked like getting worse. Moments of intense pain sometimes preceded breakthroughs in his grieving process. When he thought he'd finally adjusted to life without joy, fresh waves of longing would crash over him, revealing deeper layers of loss he hadn't yet processed. Lewis noted how grief seemed to have its own timetable, completely ignoring social expectations about moving on or getting over it. Some days he'd find himself laughing at a memory of joy, only to be overwhelmed by tears hours later. These seemingly contradictory responses taught him that healing doesn't follow a straight line or convenient schedule. Writing about this non-panic nature of grief, Lewis observed something profound. Progress in grieving often feels like going in circles, yet each circle moves slightly forward, like a spiral. What appears as repetition actually reveals new layers of truth and healing with each pass. A memory that once caused unbearable pain might later bring bittersweet comfort, then eventually even joy. This insight revolutionized how Lewis viewed recovery from loss. Instead of seeing grief as a problem to solve or a journey with a clear destination, he began recognizing it as more like learning to dance with a difficult partner. Sometimes graceful, sometimes stumbling, but always in motion. By documenting these irregular patterns of mourning, Lewis challenged conventional wisdom about grief's timeline. His experience revealed that true healing isn't about reaching a final state of being over it, but rather about learning to integrate loss into life's ongoing dance. This perspective offers freedom from artificial timelines and permission to grieve at one's own unique pace. Memories became Lewis's greatest comfort and deepest torment, striking with double-edged precision at unexpected moments. Each recollection of joy carried both sweetness and sting. Initially, memories ambushed him with cruel intensity. Every happy moment they shared twisted into a reminder of what he'd lost. Lewis described how his mind would replay their last conversations, their shared jokes, their private rituals, each memory feeling like reopening a wound just as it started to heal. Even beautiful memories felt poisoned by loss, as if happiness itself had become a form of pain. Yet gradually, something shifted in how these memories affected him. While still painful, they began carrying whispers of comfort alongside their sting. Lewis noticed how memories started preserving not just what he'd lost, but what he'd been fortunate enough to have. Joy's laugh, once a source of unbearable absence, slowly transformed into a gift he could carry forward. Most fascinating was how memories evolved over time, without losing their authenticity. Moments that initially seemed too painful to recall began offering unexpected solace. Lewis discovered that memories weren't static photographs, but living things that grew and changed as he did. Sometimes they revealed new details he'd forgotten, offering fresh perspectives on their shared life. This transformation taught Lewis something profound about memory's role in grief. Rather than trying to avoid painful memories or cling desperately to pleasant ones, he learned to welcome both kinds as essential parts of healing. Each memory, whether bitter or sweet, helped weave joy's story more deeply into fabric of his continuing life. Lewis came to view memories as bridges rather than barriers, connecting past joy to present pain, and eventually to future hope. Through this lens, remembering became less about dwelling in loss and more about maintaining a living connection with love that transcended death. His experience suggested that healing doesn't mean memories hurt less, but rather that their pain becomes meaningful rather than merely tragic. By embracing memory's dual nature, Lewis discovered a path through grief that didn't require forgetting or moving on, but instead allowed for continuing bonds with those we've lost. Profound revelation struck Lewis as months passed following Joy's death. Love didn't die when she did. Instead, it transformed, evolving into something different yet equally real. Initially, this continuing love felt like a cruel joke. What good was loving someone who was no longer there to receive it? Yet gradually, he discovered that love's persistence wasn't a source of torment, but a testament to its eternal nature. Writing in his journal, Lewis noted how his love for Joy began changing shape. No longer expressed through daily actions and shared moments, it found new ways to manifest. His love lived in how he honored her memory, in how he carried forward their shared values, in how he viewed world through eyes forever changed by knowing her. This continuing bond defied conventional wisdom about letting go or moving on. So this beautiful human Most surprising was discovering that his relationship with Joy hadn't ended. It had entered a new phase. Lewis found himself still in dialogue with her, not in a literal sense, but through how her perspective had become part of his own thinking. He'd catch himself considering what Joy would say about a situation, or laughing at something that would have amused her. These weren't signs of being stuck in grief, but evidence of love's ability to transcend physical presence. Lewis observed something revolutionary about love's nature. True love creates permanent changes in who we are. Joy's influence on his character, his thoughts, his way of seeing world, these weren't erased by her death. Instead, they became more clearly visible, like stars emerging in darkening sky. This reality challenged popular notions about grief requiring complete detachment from those we've lost. Within this transformed love, Lewis discovered an unexpected truth. Continuing to love someone who has died isn't pathological, it's profoundly human. His experience suggested that healthy grieving isn't about severing bonds with deceased, but about finding new ways to honor and express love that remains. This love becomes less about possession or presence and more about legacy and continuing influence. Through this lens, grief itself became evidence of love's endurance rather than just expression of loss. Each pang of missing Joy affirmed depth and reality of their connection, proving that some bonds transcend physical separation. Searching for hope in grief's landscape initially felt like hunting for water in a desert. Lewis discovered that hope, when it finally emerged, appeared in forms he never expected. Rather than arriving as sudden relief or dramatic breakthrough, hope crept in through tiny cracks, subtle shifts in how he experienced his loss. Early morning walks, once dreaded for their solitude, gradually became moments of quiet reflection. Small pleasures he'd thought forever tainted by grief slowly reclaimed their ability to bring joy. Books, music, even casual conversations began carrying whispers of meaning again. Hope didn't announce itself with fanfare. It showed up in these modest moments of renewed engagement with life. Most surprising was how hope often emerged from accepting rather than fighting grief. When Lewis stopped struggling against his pain, stopped trying to force healing on schedule, he found space for new possibilities. This wasn't about finding silver linings or making sense of loss. It was about discovering that meaning could coexist with unanswered questions. Writing about this different kind of hope, Lewis noted how it differed from mere optimism or wishful thinking. This hope felt more substantial, more grounded in reality because it acknowledged both loss and possibility. It didn't promise that everything would be fine, but suggested that life could still hold meaning, even beauty, alongside grief. Hope manifested in unexpected ways, in ability to support others experiencing loss, in deeper appreciation for life's fragility, in more authentic relationships freed from pretense. Lewis found himself developing new capacities for empathy, for sitting with uncertainty, for finding beauty in imperfection. These weren't compensations for his loss, but rather evidence that growth could occur even in grief's harsh soil. Perhaps most profoundly, Lewis discovered hope in realizing that Joy's impact on the world hadn't ended with her death. Her influence continued through lives she'd touched, through changes she'd catalyzed in others, through ripples of her existence that kept spreading outward. This recognition offered a different kind of hope, not for reversal of loss, but for continuing significance of love shared. Through this transformed understanding, hope became less about future outcomes and more about present meaning. It wasn't about waiting for pain to end, but about finding purpose within it. Grief, as Lewis discovered, wasn't just something to endure. It became an active force reshaping his entire being. Much like a river carves new paths through stone, grief carved fresh channels through his personality, beliefs, and ways of experiencing the world. What started as raw wound gradually evolved into something more complex, a lens that altered how he viewed everything. Most profound was how grief stripped away superficial aspects of his character while strengthening essential ones. Social pretenses fell away first. He lost patience for small talk and shallow relationships. In their place grew capacity for deeper connections, marked by honesty about life's hardships. His infamous intellectual defenses crumbled, revealing vulnerability he'd previously hidden, even from himself. Writing brought this transformation into sharp focus. His earlier works, brilliant as they were, now seemed to him somewhat detached from human experience. After grief reshaped him, his writing gained new depth. Each word weighted with lived experience, rather than mere theoretical knowledge. Pain had taught him language he couldn't have learned any other way. Changes rippled through every aspect of his life. Time felt different, more precious yet less urgent. Priorities shifted naturally without forced resolution or self-help strategies. Things that once seemed crucial faded into background, while seemingly small moments gained new significance. His capacity for joy didn't diminish, but rather deepened, becoming richer for having known sorrow. Particularly striking was how grief altered his relationship with uncertainty. Before loss, Lewis sought to explain everything, to find neat answers for life's mysteries. After experiencing grief's transformative power, he grew more comfortable with questions that had no clear answers. This comfort with ambiguity brought unexpected freedom, space to explore rather than explain. Beyond personal change, grief transformed how he connected with others. His own pain opened channels of empathy previously closed. He found himself drawn to others who carried similar wounds, able to offer comfort not through clever words, but through simple presence. This new way of relating to others' pain became one of grief's most unexpected gifts. Through documenting these changes, Lewis revealed how grief doesn't just change what we feel, it changes who we are. His experience suggested that while we don't choose grief's transformations, we can choose to remain open to ways it might reshape us into deeper, more authentic versions of ourselves. Lewis's insights transcend personal tragedy, reaching into universal human experience. Whether facing death of loved ones, end of relationships, loss of dreams, or any profound change, his discoveries illuminate paths through darkness that countless others walk. Modern grief research confirms what he learned through lived experience. Grief's complexity demands more nuanced approach than traditional models suggest. Professional counselors now echo Lewis's observations about grief's physical manifestations. Medical science has documented how loss affects sleep patterns, immune function, and even cellular aging. What Lewis described as bodily grief now has clinical validation, helping countless people recognize their physical symptoms as normal rather than alarming. Social media age brings new dimensions to Lewis's insights about continuing bonds with those we've lost. Digital memories, shared online spaces, and virtual communities create novel ways to maintain connections while processing grief. His wisdom about love's transformation proves especially relevant when digital footprints keep deceased present in unprecedented ways. Workplace cultures increasingly acknowledge grief's impact, moving away from rigid bereavement policies toward more flexible support systems. Lewis's description of grief's non-planar nature helps organizations better understand why employees might need varying forms of support at unexpected times. His insights guide development of more compassionate corporate policies. Mental health professionals apply his observations about memory's dual nature in trauma therapy and grief counseling. Modern therapeutic approaches often incorporate the idea that painful memories can eventually become sources of healing, precisely as Lewis discovered. His perspective helps people trust process rather than fighting natural rhythms of grieving. Beyond individual loss, societies face collective grief through disasters, social changes, and global challenges. Lewis's framework helps communities navigate shared trauma while honoring individual experiences. His insights prove valuable for disaster response teams, community leaders, and social workers supporting groups through collective loss. Educational institutions increasingly incorporate grief literacy into curriculum, recognizing that young people need tools for processing loss. Lewis's accessible descriptions of complex emotional experiences provide valuable teaching material, helping students develop emotional intelligence and empathy early in life. These applications demonstrate how personal insights, when articulated with honesty and depth, can illuminate universal human experiences. Lewis's journey through grief continues offering guidance to individuals and institutions seeking to navigate loss with greater wisdom and compassion. Journey through Lewis's grief reveals profound truths that resonate across time, culture, and individual circumstances. His raw honesty about wrestling with loss opens doorways for others to acknowledge their own struggles without shame. These 4 lessons, grief's nonlinear nature, memory's dual power, love's transformation, and hope's unexpected emergence, offer framework not just for surviving loss, but for growing through it. Pain carved new wisdom into Lewis's life, wisdom that continues illuminating paths for others walking through their own valleys of grief. His experience reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting or getting over it. Instead, it means integrating loss into life's continuing story, allowing it to shape us into deeper, more authentic versions of ourselves. What makes these insights particularly valuable is their grounding in real experience rather than abstract theory. Lewis didn't write about grief from comfortable distance. He wrote from inside its storm. His words carry weight of lived truth, offering both validation for those currently suffering and guidance for those supporting others through loss. Perhaps most powerfully, Lewis's journey demonstrates how personal tragedy can become source of universal insight. Through courageously sharing his own transformation, he created a legacy that continues helping others navigate their own losses. His experience shows how grief, while deeply personal, connects us to broader human experience of love, loss, and renewal. As we conclude this exploration of Lewis's profound lessons on grief, invitation stands to carry these insights forward. Whether currently facing loss or supporting someone who is, these teachings offer valuable perspective on grief's complexity and potential for transformation. If you found value in these insights about navigating loss and discovering hope, take a moment to support this channel. Hit that like button to help others find this content when they need it most. Subscribe to join our community dedicated to exploring life's deepest questions and sharing wisdom that stands test of time. Every like and subscription helps expand reach of these important conversations about grief, healing, and human resilience. Together, we create space where difficult topics can be discussed with honesty and depth. Share your thoughts and comments below. Your experiences and insights might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. Until next time, remember that even in grief's darkest moments, possibility for transformation remains.